Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here with the Ake Festival 2021 and to talk to you about one of my favorite writers and I think the best book that I've read in a very long time called Afterlives. I'm here to speak with Mr. Abdulrazak Gurnah, discussing his 10th novel, Afterlives. Abdulrazak is a novelist based in the UK. He was born in Zanzibar and in the 60s came to England. He has written 10 novels. One of them, Paradise, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1994. His books deal with war, with colonialism, I think with memory, migration, but most importantly, they deal with what we do with the aftermath of conflict, with the aftermath of trauma. And so I have found many answers in his books, and I am truly pleased and honored to have him here with us today. Mr. Gurnah, Abdulrazak, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your introduction, which is very kind.
I would like to jump right in. I have so many questions, but I'd like to just begin with Afterlives. I will tell you, I read this book last year when it came out, and it was incredibly moving for me. What was also significant about it is this history that it is unfolding for us, a history that is very not known very much in the world, though I think people in East Africa are well aware of it. Could you give us, in your own words, a bit of an overview of the history that frames Afterlives?
Sure. So it's that period, the last decades of the 19th century, just after the European powers, as they call themselves, decided to divide up Africa or what was left of it undivided, that is, by them. So in those last decades, between 1880 and, I suppose, the First World War, there are all these various nations making their claim on site, as it were. So Germany did not, at that point, have many colonies in Africa, although it did have one or two colonies in the old sense, that is to say, settlements. So there was an element of, totally of invasion in this process. It wasn't a slow process as it had been in other places of perhaps trading first and then gradually kind of spreading and becoming stronger and so on. This was just a straightforward invasion, come in and take care. So it was a military operation more or less from the beginning, from the 1880s onwards. And it was all rather brutal. More brutal than perhaps other colonizations. No, all colonizations are brutal, but this was just sudden, and within, between, as I say, there's 30 years or so between that first invasion and the First World War. It was endless conflict and endless violence in that part of the world. The Germans had already done something like this in Southwest Africa, what was now known as Namibia. And they used similar tactics, which were, generally speaking, obscene. And there is an argument, of saying that to some extent, this militaristic attitude, Hannah Arendt makes this argument, is actually what led to ideas that then inform Nazism, this totalitarian response to people, to other people, to people that are to be treated as subject people. But that's the kind of background. But there is a human dimension to it as well. That is to say, in order for such an event to take place, the Germans actually just recruited, conscripted, coerced people, local people, as well as people from other parts of Africa. In other words, mercenaries, African mercenaries, who were the actual people who carried out these operations. So there is that also to think about.
I think your novel lays this out really, really well. The devastations, the many layers of devastation that are inflicted on communities when colonialism comes in, but also this very particular way of using the local communities against each other. We can see that with Hamza, which I really want to talk about very soon. I found him one of the most complicated characters in this book. But you mentioned just now that this invasion of Germany was sudden, and it was this militaristic operation and quite brutal. And I found that the realities of that, it was in the background, but your novel, which is about this very brutal and chaotic moment, opens with a sentence that is so quiet and almost gentle. And then the book unfolds in a really quiet voice, describing this thing that is quite violent and chaotic. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your decision to write the book in this voice.
Because I'm writing about people who are not kind of like people of national significance. These are small people. These are people who are going about their lives despite whatever else is going on around them. They can't do anything about it. And so they carry on with their lives. And their lives are to do with what concerns them and their loved ones, and lack of this or shortage of that or whatever. And in the meantime, I suppose in the background, because largely the war bypassed the place that I'm talking about, in the background there is this conflagration, this violence, this horrific thing, which can only be spoken about as stories in a way, as did you know, have you heard, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And the book opens with Khalifa, and I found him so interesting. His story establishes a community that is multicultural, multi-ethnic. Could you talk about the community that you were crafting in this book? Yeah, sure. It was beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, well, it is true, that is that exaggeration, that the society, the culture of the whole that whole coast of Africa had kind of interpenetrated cultures from Asia, that is to say, from South Asia, from India, from South Arabia, from what we now call the Horn of Africa, but I mean Somalia, really, for hundreds of years, for thousands possibly, but certainly for hundreds of years. You may remember that the pilot who actually takes the first Portuguese expedition that arrives on the coast was an Indian. Traitor. So he takes Vasco da Gama across to India, and then that's the beginning of Portuguese colonialism in the Indian Ocean. There's a long, long history of web, I suppose, of an Indian Ocean culture. So yeah, that's actually what I've often written about in my work, because it is what it was. It's what I grew up with.
I was in Zanzibar not long before this pandemic, the lockdown took effect, and it's a vibrant community. It's diverse. It feels like a range of histories are colliding all in one place. And I think the book captured that the feel of it, the essence of that so well. You open this book with Khalifa, and eventually you bring us to Ilyas, the first one, I think, who will become a really complicated character as this story goes. Could you talk a little bit about him and what he represents to you in this story?
There were Ilyases all over the place in that period because there was a certain prestige about being part of the colonial project. You are associating with powerful people. You're associating with people who are bringing something new. Young people, or even older people, but certainly young people, don't always recognize the danger, if you like, that lies behind the attraction of novelty or of that kind of novel power that the Germans, or indeed the British, represented. So there are a lot of people who are volunteered to join, not just the armies, but to join the colonial project, as it were, to be part of it. It wasn't always a matter of resisting from the word go. A lot of people went along with it. Others learned quickly, others never learned, others never kind of lost that admiration. So I suppose he was one of those whose admiration for the Germans did not diminish.
Well, I think he stayed with me well after I had closed the book. Hamza stayed with me as well. But Ilyas kept nagging at me, and I still think of him now, and I think about that proximity to power that you're mentioning, the attraction of it. I don't want to give a lot away because I think everyone needs to read this book. And yet, do you think that he learns any lesson at all? That there's anything for him to learn through his journey? I don't want to give a lot away, but I found him compelling and powerful.
Okay. Well, I suppose he learned, but he probably didn't learn the absurdity of his situation, as it might seem to us today. He couldn't see that he was any kind of an irrelevance to the people that he admired so much, or at the very least, if not an irrelevance, then just something instrumental, something that can be made use of. So no, I don't suppose he learned very much.
Maybe the word isn't learned. I find the idea of being used as an instrument. His story echoed for me the real life story of Muhammad Hussein from who lived in Germany. He was an askari and had come to Germany in, I think, the early 1900s and was acting in a lot of films, and eventually was of no use to the Germans and was eventually taken to a concentration camp. I think with Ilyas, he represented this idea of what do we do with the situation we're given or that we find ourselves in, and how do we manage and cope. And he seemed in some ways to want to co-opt some of that power that he was in proximity to for himself. But I don't want to say a lot. It seemed like at a high cost. And then we have his sister, Afia, and his interactions with her as she moves through girlhood and tries to move out of the house where she's initially in was beautiful for me to see. A community in action, a family in action. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about her. It struck me that she's a girl in a world of men. And there are layers of power around her that she can't be a part of because of the nature of who she is. Could you talk a little bit about Afia?
Sure. All the women in the novel, I suppose, apart from the Frau pastor, the German, the wife of the pastor, who looks after Hamza. Maybe you'll come back to that later. But all the women are in some kind of distress, one way or another. So like Biasha in this rage, which is possibly, I don't know how you would interpret that, but it could possibly be just a frustrated rage. She is denied agency. She's having her life directed by others and so on. Despite being a battling creature, there is nothing she can do about it. And the same really with Afia. She's a girl, and the girl is suspected, is bullied, and is abandoned, except in the end. Well, anyway, we don't want to spoil that. But
no, we won't give that away. Let's talk about Hamza. You've mentioned and the complicated relationships that he has with the Germans, including the Frau, and the officer that he serves as an askari. He felt that, I don't want to say he was the heart of this book, but his situation felt more knotted and more complicated and fraught with the weight of this historical moment than maybe some of the other characters. He was always in direct contact with Germans in one way or another. This relationship with the German officer, I'm curious about how you developed this and whether you were inspired by other stories, other realities to create this thing that felt almost uncomfortable to read sometimes.
Yeah, well, I did want for there to be some kind of human dimension amongst the Germans, so that they weren't just brutal monsters. But on the other hand, and I think this would also be true of other colonial moments, on the other hand, since the drive behind colonialism is one that constructs the people who are to be colonized as inferior, or even as something worse than inferior, as not quite human, It's very, very difficult to imagine a proper human relationship between an officer who's engaged in the kind of work that the Germans were engaged in that part of the world, actually having a human relationship with those who are from the colonized people. So in a sense, what the officer experiences, I think, is both a kind of humanity, if you like, a kind of love even. But it cannot be acknowledged because he's a German and this boy, this young man, is an African. Something like that. But I was also very, very interested in the collision, if you like, of an ideology of force and cruelty, like a military ideology. I don't necessarily mean German when I say of force and cruelty. I mean a military ideology like that, which was driving the Prussian ethos, if you like, the German ethos, when it encounters somebody that it kind of recognizes as tender, shall we say.
Yeah. You convey the conflictedness within this officer really well, and I think very delicately. There is a sense that he's even confined by a system that he's participating in, and doesn't quite know what to do with himself, much less with Hamza. Literature plays a role. Reading plays a role in their relationship, and that is something that is carried over into another moment when Hamza is recuperating in the house of the pastor and his wife. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. I think that was a thread that seemed to run through Hamza's life.
The poetry, or the reading.
The reading and the poetry.
I love the idea of the difference that reading, or the capacity to read, can make, both to individual growth, as you are the growth of the individual, and also the perception of the individual. So for example, Afia learns to read. Her brother teaches her to read, which becomes a source of aggravation for her uncle, as he's called. And for somebody like Hamza, learning to read is also a sort of liberation. So I've always been fond of this idea. It's not the first time I use this notion of reading as a kind of release, as it were, from oppression. And because I do see it like that, particularly for women in certain circumstances. So both the poetry and reading are the ways in which Hamza finds some kind of, shall we say, a subterranean route, as it were, to self-knowledge, to a degree of freedom, which is not to say that he now can read, therefore he can become a captain of a ship or something like that. His capacity for understanding grows because he's interested in reading and in poetry and whatever.
And yet that ability makes the Germans uncomfortable at the same time, it seems.
Yeah. And I think it's to be expected, isn't it? I mean, the whole history of engagement with people with colonized people, all the way back to the slavery encounter, is to as much as possible befuddle them and deny them knowledge. You may remember the description that Equiano gives of when the captives who've been held in the hold of the ship are allowed, once the ship has left land and is out at sea, they are allowed to come out, and he suggests that the reason for this is because the ship's company did not want the slaves to see how the ship was made to sail, and in order to make them think that it was magic in some way. I think it's a ridiculous idea, because I'm sure a lot of those people knew perfectly well how to sail a ship, or at least a boat. But this is how he reads it, that this desire to keep the subjects, the colonized subjects, in ignorance as much as possible, and therefore reading becomes somehow an insurrection. You know, of course, that in the United States, for example, it was forbidden to teach slaves to read. It was actually illegal to do so in some states, precisely because of the idea. And Frederick Douglass makes a great deal of it in his autobiography about learning to read.
We see this act of reading. I'm not giving anything away, but by the end, with Ilyas, knowledge becomes a way to move forward. And yet, I think Ilyas, the second Ilyas, realizes that even with that, there's a stopping point. There's only so much you can learn, and when he's looking through the archives for certain information, and I found that a poignant of knowledge and history and memory and what we know and what we can remember and how much we can ever really truly learn of the past. Hamza is in the military and is an askari and is uncomfortable and very ill-suited for this life. And as he's moving through this world, I noted that you were very specific with certain dates, with certain battles, with certain massacres. And it would have been very easy for you as a novelist to skim those things and to continue to focus on, let's say, the small moments in this novel. But you also give us a wider perspective of what's happening with colonialism and Germany. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it was really to provide a pretty concrete context to what was going on. And also to say, but without maybe too much uproar, to say these are real events that were happening in the background. And so naming particular places or particular date was really a way of just making that point, I suppose, or making it clear that these things happen. This is not just a story, if you see what I mean. Although it is that, of course, but that is to just put these little pointers and markers to say it was in that place that this happened. Whereas the real places, like the pastor's compound, settlement, whatever, that is an invention. And so are so many of the actual houses and shops and whatever. But I did at the same time also want a framework that was concrete.
I told you I've been thinking about your book lately, and I thought of it again recently when I was in Berlin and I went to go see this place that has become very controversial right now in Germany, the Humboldt Forum, which is an artistic space. You could call it a museum, and it's the place of the former Prussian, it's a palace. It harkens back to the German colonial era. This place that had been bombed during World War II has now been reconstructed, billions of dollars spent to reconstruct this thing that feels like an emblem of German imperialism. Within that structure now, curators have taken out of the basements of ethnographic museums all of their holdings, and they're starting to create an exhibit of what they have. And I had a chance to walk through there, and I was struck by how many items from Africa, from across Asia, exist in that building. Most of them stolen, most of them from German imperialist times, a lot of them from Namibia, from what was German East Africa. And I started to think about the place of memory in a setting like that. How much gets erased when we're moving through museums and we're looking at these looted items, and the insistence that I think your book has in remembering certain dates and places and massacres and battles, an insistence that's pushing against these kinds of places that tell us to look but not necessarily to remember. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about history that still feels uncomfortable, that is the setting of this novel, this beautiful novel that you've written, and yet it feels like it's something that Germany hasn't quite grappled with. Germany doesn't quite know what to do. I think there's still conversations between Germany and Namibia on compensation, on restitution. What do we do with this history now in the present moment?
Well, they have to do something different, and the British as well have to do something different from what we have to do, or what African, or indeed Indian or wherever else, the rest of the world that was colonized. It is not at all surprising, really, that there is a desire to forget on the part of the Germans, on the part of the British, as much as possible, that is. At the same time, while this is happening, it's not always willful. What I mean is, it's not that all the people say, I don't want to know about this. It's just that somehow it disappears from a popular discourse. It's not taught in schools. It's not discussed in, politicians don't speak about it. Films don't talk about it, except you think about films that have to do with that period in Africa. It's always like African Queen or King Solomon's Mines or whatever. So because this is not part of a public or popular discourse, then people just don't know about it, or when they hear about it from a distance, as it were, and think, oh no, not them again, talking about colonialism. It's all over, isn't it? And at all levels, it seems to me, not for everyone, but at all levels, it seems to me, there is this attitude that it's finished with. We don't really want to know about that. Please, here you are, have some aid, go away. In Germany, it's even worse in a way, because they lost their colonies as they see it. And then, of course, came the Holocaust. And they have some tremendously horrible memories to sort out even before they get to what happened in Deutsche Ostafrika, or Tanganyika, as it became. And so, again, it isn't totally surprising that the memory of that period recedes in the face of the horrors that then occur in the decades that follow from then on, which they still can't come to terms with fully. So, imagine if they can't, as the books that they write, current generation of Germans write, clearly show that there is a kind of coming to terms with those events in the 1940s that has still not quite happened. I mean, I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying that, you can see how it is that that these are distant events for many people, or indeed regrettable, but there is a coming to terms going on with younger people, or even indeed not just younger people. Various attempts to describe this. You mentioned the Bayume story. Well, that was made into a film by Eva Knopf. I don't know if you've seen that. Have you seen the film?
No, I will.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting. So she made a film of that man's life. I think she did it as a project for her PhD or something like that. But also that we now realize that, in fact, there are many other people of African descent who were living in Germany during that period, during the period just before and the Nazi period, more than we ever knew about before. And some of them have written about it. Other people are researching into those areas. So there is a kind of coming to terms, but it's a long way off yet.
As you were speaking just now, I was thinking about one of the characters in your novel who is haunted, in a sense, by ghosts. Specifically, I think by Ilya's ghost. Now, if I'm remembering this part correctly, and that moment, hearing the dead speak or trying to search for people who are no longer there, echoes what you're saying right now. It's not only Germany or the colonial powers that have to begin to grapple with this history that they consciously or subconsciously would like to erase, but it's also the people who experienced it, or the people connected to that in one way or another in Africa or in those formerly colonized countries. I was thinking about the Askari as you were talking too, and the Schutztruppen, if I'm saying it correctly. Could you talk about these characters in the novel, which are sometimes come to the forefront and then slowly go back again, and also the realities? What happened to them when Germany lost the colonies?
Well, most of them would have just receded to wherever it was, like those who before. I mean, like the people who were recruited by the British to fight their wars after the wars, and they go back to wherever it is. Unfortunately, not all of them did. So some of them remained part of the colonial armies, and then became the post-colonial armies, and then became the coup makers. You can see a direct line from being a mercenary of the British to becoming the president of Uganda, and others. So I suppose for the losers, for the German Askaris, once the war was over, they were just abandoned. Some of them received pensions, but not all of them. They were just left to take care of themselves. And those who'd been taken prisoners, as in fact was the case with the Ilyas in the novel, was once the war was over, the British just let them go. There was no resettlement or anything, just off you go. Go find your own feet somewhere. And since so many of these people were not actually local, some of them were from Sudan, some of them were from Mozambique, from Angola, from wherever, all over the place. They didn't care where they got people. So some of them were a long way from home. But yeah, they were left. They were no longer of any use, so they were just left.
The focus that your novel places on these small lives, as you've called it, and on these individuals, brings to the forefront the many consequences of not only just the presence of a colonial force in a country, but what happens to that community or those communities or families once that colonial force leaves, and how people manage to try to salvage some kind of a life from everything, the debris of what's been left from war and conflict. And the role of Christianity in this felt like another thread, something that should have been comforting to some people, yet was used as an oppressive tool for others. And Hamza's relationship with this pastor and his family, I wondered if you could talk about that. It feels to me emblematic of this space where there's a colonial force and then all of a sudden it's gone, and people have to cope with the remnants of what's left behind.
Yeah. Well, one thing to say straight off, of course, is that colonialism transformed not only the colonized countries, but it actually, to be honest, it's transformed the way the world works. And it continues to do so. It's not just a matter of things happened during colonialism and then they all went home and everything turned to something else. I didn't want to say that the role of Christianity was coercive, although it was. I mean, Christianity was a partner in the colonization project. But I also wanted to say that this was a more ambiguous role than sometimes seems. That is to say, what the ideology that was driving Christianity was an ideology of kindness and salvation and so on. Whereas, of course, the ideology of the colonizing administration was the opposite, was how do we make these people work? How do we make them give us what we want? And so there is a kind of contradiction or ambivalence in the role of the, shall we say, the missionary, who is both carrying out, in some way or another, colonial policy, in establishing European rule, and yet at the same time speaking a language of succor and salvation and kindness and so on, and without being hypocritical about it. Although it's easy to imagine that it is a hypocrisy, but without necessarily being duplicitous. Actually thinking, I mean this. I mean, I'm worried about your soul. I want to save you, and so on. But what lies behind this, of course, is an assumption of the status and condition of one in relation to the other, if you like, the power structure between them. I know better than you do for you, and for you, I've come to bring you blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So this is the kind of role that I wanted the pastor to play. I wanted him to play this ambivalent role of both a kind of moral authoritarian, if that is not too contradictory, and yet at the same time also somebody who is troubled by the ideology he carries out. I didn't want it to be Christianity is simply partner of colonialism, full stop, thank you. And then I also put the Frau there, who in fact is another way of softening, if you like, the role or the presence of Christianity in colonialism. I don't know if I was too kind to her.
I found her complex. I didn't necessarily like her. but I don't have to like her. I found her absolutely intriguing and complicated, the way that the best characters need to be written. But I was thinking also about her story in relation to the stories of the other women in the novel, and how it seemed that she herself is subjugated to certain laws, certain rules, certain ways of existing, because she's also under a patriarchal power, and has expectations placed on her.
But she does undermine it a little bit by giving Hamza the books that he shouldn't be given, for example. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah, she does do that. Could you talk a little bit about that ending, or this idea that I think is really coursing through the whole book about memory, remembering, community, what we might be able to gather from the remains of everything?
Well, you told me not to talk about the ending, so that makes it a difficult. But I'm not surprised you're so interested in this, because that's what you write about as well, in both your novels. So it's all that we have, really. You know, especially when societies are not signed up, if you like, to the complex business of keeping archives and recording things, or indeed are not just literate, do not write down what it is that has happened to them. And memory is held by individuals, if you like, in the minds and imaginations of individual people who pass those stories on, and then stories become a way of seeing the world. Well, stories always are a way of seeing the world, but in this way of exchanging, of transmitting stories in this way, then you transmit them in a humane way, rather than having to search for them and whatever. Although, of course, searching for them is also good, because it means that we're not able to fake stories to comfort ourselves, which I'm sure sometimes happens, or often happens, when the story is in the hands, as it were, of an individual who will perhaps structure it and construct it in a way that is pleasing to him or to her, perhaps. So both archives, wonderful if they can be kept, but since we don't always have them, or we only have colonial archives, which are already telling their own stories and not necessarily the stories of those that are subjugated by colonialism, then memory and that kind of transmission of memories is absolutely crucial as a way of saving cultures and histories, or just not believing that everything about the past was dishonorable.
This is your 10th novel. For some of us who are very slow writers, 10 is an incredible number. You came to the UK, I think, in the 60s, leaving an oppressive regime in Zanzibar, an oppressive political system. Please correct me if I'm remembering this wrong, but your writings initially were stories set in England, and then it seems slowly you've moved closer and closer to Zanzibar in each book. And I wondered if you could talk about that work. It feels like moving from one place, and slowly your stories are coming back to where you began.
Yeah, almost, but almost right, I mean. But actually, my first book was called Memory of Departure, and was a book very much about being nothing to do with the UK at all. It was very much about being there, as it were. And sometime during that period, I wrote that book. It took me a long time for that book first to be finished. I was in my 20s when I started writing it. It was published in 1987 when I was 39. So it took a long time to both complete writing it and to also eventually find a publisher. In the meantime, of course, my life has changed. I'm living in England all of this time. And so when that one is finished with and aside, the next thing I write about is Pilgrim's Way, and it is about both places, I guess. And by this time, I'm living in England. So I believe also that, you write about things you know and things you're experiencing and things you understand. And that is what I understood then. I understood my life. I didn't really think it would be possible for me to return to Zanzibar because of the way that the regime worked. Basically, if you left like it used to be an exit visa in South Africa, except you didn't get a visa. You just ran away, as it were. So I didn't think it would change. And by then, I was thinking my life was going to be willy-nilly. I was going to have to live in England. So I was writing the third book I wrote was really about the experience of migration, of living in the UK, and so not just for me, but for things that people I knew about. Then things changed, and the regime changed, and then we were all able to return if we wanted, and so on. So I went back and spent several weeks traveling around and so on. And when I came back, I thought, Paradise. So then I wrote Paradise. And then from then on, but still really my work has, this is my experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's been both about living here in England, but also being from Zanzibar or from other places from East Africa. And so this back and forth is, I think, present in most of my work, rather than that there was a kind of a continuous sort of road going that way and then returning the other way. I think, I've always kind of written about both places somehow or the other, and I think about both places more or less every day, really. So I think I would say no, there isn't a kind of a linear sort of diagram, as it were, in this, because I'm back and forth most of the time.
Do you have an idea? Maybe this is not your perception, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. Indian Ocean seems to be something that we don't talk enough about this part of the world.
Partly, I suppose, it's because it's web of connections in a way which is not sort of Atlantic Europe, Atlantic Americas, and so on, but they are within the ocean or within the littorals of the ocean. That people still look and understand and know a great deal more about what's going on in Yemen and in India, and perhaps even further afield along the east, as it were. And part of the reason for this is because there is this long-lasting historical connection. And there are these ocean currents, and there are these monsoon winds, which kind of make it very easy for people to come and go between these places. So if you take like Swahili, for example, the language of the coast, which has now spread everywhere into the heart of Africa, but that is spoken all the way up the road, as it were. So you can go to Oman and people speak Swahili. You go to Hadramaut, to Somalia, to wherever, and so on. So if you take language, if you take cuisine, if you take religion as well, and the stories, which are common to all of these cultures. So I'm suggesting that there is a kind of self-contained thing about the cosmopolitan cultures of the Indian Ocean, which do not necessarily reference Europe or the Americas, except in the modern world you have to, but do not, as it were, in a kind of narrative or traditional sense. So I think that's part of the reason. And maybe the other part of the reason is because they came so late to kind of like an awareness of what was going on. And much of what happened in the Indian Ocean, say for the Dutch, for the Portuguese, for the French, and so on, has become marginal history. The British know a great deal about the Indian Ocean because India is so central to the conception of imperial Britain. Not only is it so central to its conceptions, but of course, so many Indians are now senior members of the UK government, the Home Office, the Home Secretary, the Health Secretary, the Chancellor, etc. So I think India is very close in the imagination, if you like, of the UK. Perhaps not so in the United States, and perhaps not so with the French and so on.
Right. Quickly, before we need to wrap up, I wondered if you could tell us, what are you working on now? What seems to be the next, maybe the direction of the next thing you're doing?
I retired 4 years ago. Before that, I was always writing and teaching, which makes life interesting. Not impossible, but it does mean that you have to manage your time, very strictly, as it were, when it's writing time and when it's teaching time. Then since retirement, it was just fantastic. I wrote Afterlives after retirement, and it was just brilliant just to sit there and work every day and get it all done and so on. So yeah, I'm on something else. Okay. But I'll leave it like that, I think.
Yeah, I will not ask. I understand how that is.
Yeah.
I understand. Abdulrazak, if there was one thing that you would want readers to know, to remember about this book, Afterlives, something you would like them to take away from it, what would it be?
Something to do with looking after each other. Something to do with how people learn through pain, if you like, and what they learn is kindness. You ask for one thing,
That's
one
the
thing.
thing. I think that's wonderful, and that is a wonderful note to learn kindness. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Abdulrazak Gurnah, for this incredible, wide-ranging conversation. To all of you at AKE listening in, tune in for other shows, but thank you so much for being here. Please read Afterlives.
Let me introduce a new wave, we change the rules. A new app that you can use. Wanna change your life, then choose. Save money and invest. Pay bills when you decide. Safe and secure for you when you need a loan, request it. One bank for you, one bank for me. So chill and enjoy the ride. Stop the current account on it. One bank.
One Bank by Sterling. Open a current account and start transacting.